The first time Evelina Marchetti saw Adrian De Luca, he was standing beside a coffin. Rain poured across the Milanese cemetery in silver sheets, turning the manicured grounds to rivers of black mud. Powerful men in tailored suits bowed their heads around him like soldiers before a king, shoulders heavy, jaws locked, eyes cast downward, with the practiced submission of men who had learned through painful experience that looking directly at Adrian De Luca for too long was a dangerous mistake. Nobody spoke. Nobody even breathed loudly, because Adrian De Luca was the kind of man people feared quietly, the kind of fear that lived in his stomach, cold and permanent, like a stone swallowed years ago that never quite passed. He was 32 years old. Dark hair, dark suit, dark everything, as if the world around him existed in color, only to make him look more like something carved from shadow. His face was angular and precise, beautiful in the way that storms were beautiful before they destroyed something. There was nothing soft about him, nothing warm, nothing that suggested he had ever, in his entire life, needed anything from anyone. Evelina stood at the edge of the mourners, half sheltered beneath a black umbrella that did nothing against the sideways rain. She had come to this cemetery to visit her grandmother's grave, to rouse over nothing to do with this funeral, nothing to do with these men. She should have left the moment she noticed them. She should have turned and walked and never looked back. Instead, she looked at him, and then he looked directly at her. For one impossible second, everything around them disappeared. The priests, the rain, the mourners, coffin between them. Only those dark eyes remained, watching her from across the graves with an intensity that felt less like a glance and more like a verdict. Like he already knew something she didn't like. He had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Evelina looked away first. She always looked away first. She was 24 years old, and practical and sensible, the daughter of a man who dealt in art imports, the granddaughter of a woman who believed that trouble recognized itself in other people's eyes. She tucked her chin against her chest, stepped backward through the mud, and told herself it was nothing. Men like that didn't look at women like her. Men like that looked at nothing. Men like that didn't need to look. They simply waited. And the world arranged itself accordingly. She went home, soaked to the bone, poured herself tea, and forgot about it entirely. Or so she told herself. The truth was, she thought about those eyes for the next 3 days without fully understanding why. Not the way a woman thought about an attractive man. Not that kind of thinking. The kind of thinking you did about something wrong. Something that didn't fit. A door slightly open in a house where all doors should be closed. On the 4th day, her father came home with the weight of a condemned man sitting on his shoulders. The penthouse was quiet that evening. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that pressed against the walls from the inside, looking for a way out. Her father, Renato Marchetti, sat across from her at the dining table with his hands wrapped around a glass of scotch he hadn't drunk. He was 60 years old and silver-haired, a man who had built a modest empire through careful moves and careful alliances, a man who had always known how to keep the right people happy. He had survived 30 years in a world where survival was an art form. But tonight, he looked defeated. Tonight, he looked like a man who had run out of moves. "The De Luca family protected us once," he said quietly, still unable to meet her eyes. 11 years ago, when the Ferraro syndicate decided your uncle's debt was our family's problem, Adrian De Luca interceded. "He magi et stoppi." He asked for nothing in return. Evelina set down her fork. "What does that mean?" asked for nothing. It meant he was collecting the debt for later. Her father finally looked at her then, and the guilt in his eyes was so raw, so exposed, that it took her breath away. "He's collecting it now." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Evelina had ever heard. "No," she whispered. "He has been more than generous with the terms." "No?" She stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. You are not telling me that you are selling me too. It is not selling, her father's voice cracked. It is a marriage. A legal marriage. With a contract that protects you, I don't care about the contract. She pressed her hands flat against the table, leaning forward, watching him flinch. I care that my father is sitting across from me and telling me he promised me to a man I have never met. Silence. He specifically asked for you, her father said, barely above a whisper. The room tilted slightly. Evelina's voice went very quiet. What did you say? He didn't ask for a Marchetti daughter. Her father closed his eyes. He asked for you. By name. By description. He knew your birthday. He knew where you studied. He knew about your mother's illness last winter. He paused. He has known about you for some time, Evelina. The silence after that was a different kind of silence entirely. Not the silence of shock. The silence of a door swinging slowly open onto a darkness that had been there all along, and somewhere in the back of her mind, against every rational instinct she possessed, she thought of dark eyes watching her across a cemetery in the rain. Like a man finding something he had spent years searching for. 3 nights later, she arrived at the De Luca estate during a thunderstorm that felt like the world agreeing with her. The estate sat above the cliffs outside the city, surrounded by ancient cypress trees that stood like sentries in the dark. The iron gates were 15 feet tall and opened without anyone touching them. She noticed the cameras before she noticed anything else. Small, perfectly placed, watching everything. The mansion itself was something from another century. Dark stone walls, arched windows with candlelight burning behind thick glass, towers at either end that disappeared into the low clouds. It should have looked beautiful. It should have looked like the kind of place where old money and old history lived quietly together. Instead, it looked like a place that held its breath. The housekeeper who met her at the door was a woman of perhaps 60, thin and severe and courteous in the way that felt like a warning. Her name was Signora Batta. She led Evelina through marble corridors hung with oil paintings of people who all seemed to share the same watchful eyes, up a wide staircase and to a suite of rooms in the east wing that had been prepared with uncomfortable precision, flowers on the table, wood in the fireplace, fresh linens that still smelled like something other than a house anyone actually lived in. Adrian himself came to her that first night at exactly 8. Oh, single. Clock dot, not a minute before, not a minute after. He stood in the doorway of her suite and looked at her the way you looked at something you had waited a long time to see and were now quietly confirming was real. No smile, no greeting that suggested warmth. Just that weight behind his eyes that she was beginning to recognize something vast and patient and entirely focused on her. You look exactly the same, he said. Evelina stared at him. We have never met. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, not embarrassment. Something quieter and more complicated. The look of a man choosing deliberately not to say something. Dinner is at 9, he said instead. I'll have someone come for you. He was gone before she could answer. That was how it began. The first week at the estate taught her things in the same way. A cold room taught you, not through instruction, but through exposure. She learned that certain hallways were off limits after 10 p.m., though no one ever said so directly. She learned this because of the guards who appeared at the corridors like furniture that had rearranged itself overnight, standing with their hands at their sides and their faces, empty of everything except the specific kind of patience that came from being paid very well to stand in one place. She learned that the east wing where she slept was separated from the rest of the house by a set of doors she had initially assumed were decorative, until she tried them on the 3rd morning and found them locked from the outside. She was not a prisoner. This was made very clear to her. She could go to the gardens. She could go to the library. She could request a car and a driver for the city. She had money deposited into an account. She had a phone. She had every comfort that comfort could offer. She simply could not go into certain rooms. She simply could not ask certain questions. And every single night at exactly 2:30 a.m., someone screamed somewhere inside the estate. Not a scream of pain exactly, or not only that, it was the kind of sound that lived at the intersection of pain and despair and something almost like release, stretched thin and raw and terrible down the long stone corridors of the house before cutting off completely, as if a switch had been thrown. The first night she heard it, she sat upright in bed with her heart crashing against her sternum, certain something catastrophic had happened, certain she needed to run, certain nothing followed. No voices, no footsteps, no doors. Only the wind against the windows and the sound of her own breathing. The second night, she pressed herself against the door of her suite and listened, trying to identify the direction. Somewhere below her, somewhere beneath the main floor. Maybe the basement levels, if the house had them. The sound came and went in 45 seconds. Exactly. By the third night, she had stopped pretending she wasn't counting. By the third night, she had also noticed that Adrian was never in the house when the screaming started. He disappeared every evening somewhere between midnight and 1 a.m. She knew this because she had started listening. She knew the sound of his footsteps on the marble, heavier on the right foot than the left. A pattern she could not have explained, knowing how she knew it except that she had simply learned it. The way you learn things in a house full of silence. She heard him leave. She heard the specific sound of the east wing doors being unlocked, then locked again behind him. He returned between 3 and 4, always, after the screaming had stopped. Always smelling, when she passed close enough to catch it, like rain and wood smoke and something darker underneath, something iron sweet and wrong that she refused, for the first several days, to name. He never explained, never threatened, never raised his voice or gave her any reason in the daylight hours to feel anything except the particular discomfort of a woman living in a stranger's house by someone else's arrangement. He was courteous at dinner. He asked her careful questions about her education and her interest with the attention of a man conducting research. He remembered every answer. He never repeated a question. He watched her when she spoke with that same still intensity that had arrested her in the cemetery, and when she was done speaking, he would nod once and look away, as if filing something precious in a place only he could. Access dot. She could not decide if she was afraid of him or furious with him or something else she had no accurate word for. She could not decide if the thing she felt when he looked at her was dread or something that lived just on the other side of it. Something that frightened her precisely because it was single, quotes T dots. She found the door on the 11th night. She had not been looking for it. Or rather, she had been looking for something else entirely. She had followed the screaming for the first time instead of simply listening to it, slipping out of her suite in the dark while her pulse ticked in her throat, moving through the corridor with her hand against the wall. The sound had led her down the service stairs, at the back of the east wing, down a second staircase she had never noticed, hidden behind what she had assumed was a storage closet door, unlocked tonight. For some reason she chose not to examine too closely. Down through stone passages that grew colder with every step, lit only by dim wall-mounted fixtures that barely interrupted the darkness. The screaming had stopped by then. Whatever she was going to find, she was going to find in silence. The passage ended at a heavy wooden door with a modern electronic lock that had been left impossibly, undeniably, slightly ajar. Evelina stood outside it for a full 2 minutes. Then she pushed it open. The room was large, larger than she expected, a converted basement space, stone walls and low ceilings, the kind of room that had been many things over many centuries and was now something that defied easy monitors. 12 of them arranged in a grid, each showing a different camera feed. The gates, the gardens, the corridors, the road that led from the city. Surveillance architecture she had expected in a place like this. For a man like this, It was the opposite wall that took the air from her lungs. Floor to ceiling, end to end, dot photographs. Dot hundreds of them. Thousands. Maybe. Pinned with the methodical density of an archive. Organized in ways she couldn't immediately decode dates, perhaps, or locations, or some internal logic known only to the man who had built this. All of them were photographs of her. Evelina at 17, walking out of a secondary school in the autumn light, a backpack over one shoulder, laughing at something out of frame. Evelina at 19, studying in a university library, her hair loose, her cheek resting on her hand, completely unaware. Evelina entering a cafe on the Via Brera. She had visited perhaps 6 times in her life and had not thought about since. Evelina sleeping on an airplane, a window seat, her face turned toward the glass, defenseless in the particular way of sleeping people. Evelina crying outside a hospital. The winter her mother was ill. Someone had been there for that too. Her knees weakened, not suddenly. Slowly, the way foundations failed, one small thing at a time, until the whole structure was wrong. She reached for the wall, found it, held on. She made herself keep looking because stopping felt like a kind of surrender she could not afford. She found the oldest photographs in the far bottom corner, sorted with the same meticulous care as everything else. A photograph taken 15 years earlier, a girl of Nini, maybe 10, slight dark-haired, standing on a stretch of wet road at night. Behind her, a car was burning, orange and white, and terrible against the darkness, the kind of fire that left nothing. Evelina recognized herself before she recognized the road, before she recognized the burning car that had been her uncle's. On the night she was not supposed to have been inside it, on the night she had climbed in after her father's meeting because she had wanted to see the city lights, and nobody had noticed until it was almost too late. The crash, the door forced open, the hands pulling her out through broken glass. She had never seen his face that night. She had been 9 years old, and the world had been fire and noise, and then arms, and then safety, and then nothing because she had passed. Out from shock on the wet road and woken up in a hospital with her father, asleep in a chair beside her, and no clear memory of who had pulled her from the wreck. In the photograph, standing beside the burning car, half turned toward, something off-rim, covered in blood and ash, and what looked like broken glass embedded in his forearms, was a boy of perhaps 17. Dark hair, angular face, dark eyes, that even in a photograph, even taken at this distance and in this light, had a quality of watchfulness that was entirely, unmistakably Adrian De Luca. 15 years younger, bleeding from a dozen places, standing beside the wreck of the car he had just pulled her from. Watching her, even then, even before she had any idea he existed, sob that rose in Evelina's throat was not grief, and it was not relief, and it was not terror, though it contained elements of all three. She pressed her hand against her mouth and held it there, and the room around her felt like it was contracting, the photographs pressing inward from every side, every version of her life, laid out with the care of something sacred, and the methodology of something obsessive, and the sheer, overwhelming weight of 15 years of, you were never supposed to find this room. The voice behind her was calm, quiet, deadly, in the specific way of things that didn't need to raise their volume to be taken seriously. Evelina turned slowly. Adrian stood in the doorway wearing black gloves stained, dark red in the candlelight. His jacket was gone. His shirt was dark with something she recognized now, something she had smelled on him for 11 nights and refused to name. His face was expressionless in the way that only people with total control over themselves achieved, not blank, not empty, but locked. Everything behind a wall built by decades of practice. Except his eyes. His eyes were not locked. His eyes were the thing behind all the other walls. The thing the walls had been built to protect or to hide or to contain. She didn't know which. And she wasn't certain it mattered. Because she was looking at it directly now, and it was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. Not because it was monstrous. Because it wasn't. Because it was something she had no framework for. A longing so enormous and so old and so completely focused on her that it rewrote everything she thought she knew about. The last 11 days, the last 3 weeks, the last 15 years of her life without her knowledge. For the first time since meeting him, she looked into his eyes and saw past the cold and the control and the careful, dangerous beauty of him. And she saw the boy on the road, Dot standing in the rain beside the burning car, refusing to leave. The silence between them was its own living thing. Evelina's heartbeat was enormous in her ears. She was aware of every detail simultaneously. The cold of the stone floor through her bare feet, the smell of smoke and iron, the red-stained gloves, the 12 monitors still cycling through camera feeds behind her back, and the photographs, all the photographs, closing in from every direction. She should have been screaming. She should have been running. Instead, she heard herself say, very quietly, "How long?" Adrian did not pretend to misunderstand her. 15 years, he said. 2 months. 17 days. She breathed. In, out. Measured. You pulled me from the car. Yes. I was 9 years old. You were 17. Something moved through his expression. Not apology. Noche, Kichi. I was there because of your father's meeting. Not there for you. I didn't know you existed until I saw you through the window of that car. And then I couldn't stop. The simplicity of it was the most frightening thing he had ever said to her, because it wasn't delivered with drama or justification or the performance of emotion. It was delivered the way a man stated a fact he had examined from every angle for 15 years, and had simply, eventually, accepted. Evelina looked at the photographs, looked back at him. You watched me grow up. I kept you safe. That is not the same thing. No, he agreed. It isn't. She took a step toward him, which surprised them both, she thought. Not toward escape. The door was behind him, but there were other ways out, and she had stopped calculating exits 3 sentences ago without entirely knowing why. Toward the thing his face was barely containing. The Ferraro dead, she said. That was you. 11 years ago. You stepped in because they were going to use your family to find you. His jaw tightened. The Ferraros had a particular interest in collecting certain kinds of debt. I removed the interest. By doing what? A beat. Nothing you need to carry, he said. She stared at him. And the screaming every night. The blood on your hands right now. Is that also nothing I need to carry? He looked down at the gloves, as if he had forgotten them. He peeled them off with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times, set them on a surface beside the door, and looked back at her with the same expression, locked, controlled everything behind the wall, except his eyes. There are people, he said, choosing words with the precision of a man who measured language the way other men measured weapons, who have decided that having something I value makes them powerful. They find out what I care about. They attempt to use it. He paused. They have been attempting it with increasing frequency. The implications settled over her like cold water. You brought me here to protect me, she said slowly. Not as a debt. Not as a marriage. The marriage is protection, he said. My name is protection. My walls, my gods, my... He stopped, started again. No one touches what belongs to me. I don't belong to you. Something flared in his expression, something hot and immediate and quickly suppressed. No, he said, you don't. I know that. A pause that had weight. It doesn't change what I would do to keep you alive. Evelina stood in the middle of the room, full of her own face, and looked at the man who had built it and tried to find the correct emotional response to something that had no precedent in anything she had ever experienced. He was dangerous. She knew that, without question. The blood on the gloves was real. The screaming every night was real. The network of surveillance and violence that he moved through with such quiet competence was real. And she was standing inside it. And she had been standing inside it in various forms since she was 9 years old without knowing. He was also the reason she was alive, the reason her family was intact, the reason she was beginning to understand that several very bad things had simply never happened to her, had approached her life and then retreated, as if stopped at a perimeter she couldn't see. These two things were both completely true, and she had no framework that could hold them at the same time. "What happens now?" she asked. Adrian looked at her with those 15-year patient eyes and said nothing for a long time. "That depends," he finally said, "on what you decide." "That's the first time you've said that." "I know. Everything before this. The marriage, the estate, the coming here. None of that was my decision." "No," he said, "it wasn't." Something shifted behind his eyes. The first true fracture she had seen in him. A crack in the wall so slight and so quickly repaired that she would have missed it if she hadn't been looking directly at him. "I told myself it was the only way to keep you safe. I told myself it was necessary, that the alternative was worse." He looked at the photographs, then back at her. "I didn't ask. That was wrong." The admission fell into the room like something heavy. Not an apology designed to charm. Not a calculated move. Just a fact, stated by a man who was unaccustomed to stating such things, with a particular rawness of something long. "Carried in private." Evelina looked at him. She looked at the photographs. She looked at the door. "I want the rooms unlocked," she said. "Done. I want to know the truth when I ask for it. Not protected. Not filtered. The truth." A longer pause. "That will not be easy for you." "I didn't ask if it would be easy." Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile and was not quite its opposite, a softening, maybe, so brief and so unfamiliar on him that it was almost painful to see, as if a muscle long unused had been asked to move for the first time and had managed it, barely, after significant effort. "Agreed," he said. She did not leave. Not in the weeks that followed. She would examine that decision from multiple angles. The way you examined a strange object found in a drawer, turning it over, testing its weight, trying to determine whether it was beautiful or dangerous or both. She had the means to leave. She had the right to leave. Every rational voice she possessed told her to leave. She did not leave. The rooms were unlocked the following morning. She tested each one carefully, half expecting some of them to still resist. Some line she hadn't seen yet, some qualification. They all opened. The guards who had stood in certain corridors were gone. The east wing doors were simply doors. She explored the house properly for the first time and found that it was beneath the locked doors and the surveillance architecture and the particular atmosphere of a place where dangerous things happened quietly. Genuinely beautiful. A library with 12-foot shelves and a ladder on rails. A conservatory full of plants that someone tended with real care. She found out later this was Adrian, a detail that unsettled her in ways she couldn't fully explain. A room at the top of the north tower with windows on all 4 sides and a view of the sea. She found that room and she sat in it for 2 hours and did not think about anything, which was the closest she had come to peace in 3 weeks. Adrian gave her the truth in careful, measured doses after that, as if he was calibrating for something, not lying, not withholding in the old way, but choosing each piece with the deliberateness of someone who understood that the full architecture of what he was might, if shown all at once, cause a collapse, thought she? Learned about the De Luca organization in pieces, the scope of it, the nature of it, the specific kind of justice, if that was what it was, that it administered in places where other justice did not reach. She learned about the screaming at 2:30 a.m. interrogations conducted in the basement levels of men who had been brought to the estate for reasons she now understood. and she sat with that knowledge and turned it over and chose with clear eyes. Not to pretend it was something other than what it was. She learned that the blood on his gloves was real and that he did not ask for her absolution for it, and that she respected him. Strangely, more for that than she would have for any attempt to soften it. She learned that he had not slept more than 4 hours in any night for 15 years, because the thing that kept him from sleeping was the same thing that had built this room full of photographs, and he had chosen to manage it instead of cure it because he had no interest in a cure. She learned one evening when the sky above the cliffs had gone the dark red of a wound healing, that he had almost intervened when she was 22, and briefly engaged to a man she had left after 4 months. Almost, she repeated. He wasn't dangerous, Adrian said. He was looking at the sea, just wrong. And if he had been dangerous. He turned to look at her then with something in his expression. She was beginning to know the thing behind the wall. The thing the walls had been built to contain. He wouldn't have stayed dangerous long. She should have found that terrifying. She found it something else. Something she still had no accurate word for. Something that sat in her chest and quietly rearranged the furniture. The first time she touched him was accidental. Or she told herself it was. She would stop telling herself that later. But at the time it felt important to have the excuse available. They were in the library. She had been reaching for a book on the upper shelf, and the ladder had shifted, and she had caught herself against him, or he had caught her. More precisely. The way he always seemed to be positioned exactly where she might need someone to be, without any visible calculation involved. His hands on her arms, her hands on his chest, the smell of him up-close cedarwood and rain, and underneath it, iron-cold thing she had learned to read now as the part of him that lived in the dark. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. Neither of them moved. "You planned this," she said. "The latter, the last 15 years. "No," he said. His voice was different up close, lower, stripped of the careful distance he maintained at dinner. Archie the cliffs in the places where there was room to be composed. I watched. I protected. I told myself that was it. His hands had not moved from her arms. He was not pulling her closer, and he was not letting go, and the space between them was exactly large enough to be a question. "No," he said. For the second time, Evelina looked at him. This impossible man, this dangerous man, this man who had built an entire architecture of watching and protecting and staying away, and had then, with the patience of something that had simply decided to wait as long as necessary, arranged for her to be here. She thought about the burning car, the 9-year-old girl in the road, the 17-year-old boy covered in blood who had stayed. "You should have talked to me," she said. "Iventa, Wally, you should have let me know you existed. I know, you don't get to decide for me. I know. Apausi, I'm learning." The thing in her chest rearranged more furniture. She didn't step back. She also didn't step forward. Not yet. Not tonight. That would come later, in its own time, on her own terms, because those were the terms she had set and he had agreed to, and she was going to hold him to them in every particular. But she stayed not in the space between them, which was exactly large enough to be a question. And for the first time in the 5 weeks since a funeral in the rain, the first time since her father's face across a dinner table, the first time since she had arrived at a house of locked doors and dark secrets, and a man who had been watching her since she was 9 years old, the question didn't feel like only a question. It felt like the beginning of an answer. Later, months later, when the rooms had all been open for long enough that she had stopped testing them, when the East Wing had become simply her wing, when the North Tower room had become hers in the way that places become yours, not through ownership, but through returning to them, often enough that they begin to hold the shape of your thinking. She went back to the room beneath the house. Not alone. She went with him. The monitors were still there. The surveillance feeds still cycled. The photographs were still on the wall. All of them. Because she had not asked him to take them down, and he had not offered, and somewhere in the strange new vocabulary they were building between them, they had both understood, without discussion, that the photographs were part of the truth she had said she wanted. She stood before the wall. She looked at herself at 9, and 17, and 22. She looked at the moments she hadn't known were being witnessed: the tears outside the hospital, the laughter in the university library, the sleeping face turned toward an airplane window. "Does it frighten you?" Adrian asked. He was standing a few feet behind her, the way he always stood now, close enough to be present, far enough to give her the room she had asked for. "Yes," she said. It did. And now she was quiet for a moment. Not searching for the answer. She had the answer. Sitting with it, the way you sat with things that were complicated and true in yours. "Now it looks like someone who didn't know what else to do," she said, with something they didn't know how to put down. The silence behind her was full. "That's what it was," he said. She turned to look at him. He was watching her. He was always watching her. That had not changed, and she did not expect it to change. It was woven into the particular fabric of who he was, the way the iron gates and the cliff-top mansion and the dark hours were woven into it. But the quality of the watching had changed. It was still enormous. It was still focused entirely on her. It was still the most overwhelming attention she had ever been the subject of, and she suspected it always would be. But it wasn't only protection now. It wasn't only the vigil of a man standing guard over something precious. It was something that looked, in the dim light of the room full of her own history, remarkably like being known. Not perfectly, not safely, not in any way the world would look at and call reasonable dots, but completely dots irrevocably, in a specific way that only happened when someone had been paying attention. For 15 years and 2 months and 17 days, to every version of you that had ever existed. Evelina looked at Adrian De Luca, and for the first time in the history of them, she let him see her looking back.